A friend of mine on Facebook gave me this article, The Legacy of Jim Jones and the Cult of Donald Trump, by Susie Mitzer. In his prime, Dad dripped charisma. He engaged and charmed and enthralled. This is Stephen Jones, the son of Jim Jones, speaking. This is not how most of us think of Jim Jones, the leader of the People's Temple. Rather, we consider him, at his worst, the megalomaniac leader of a doomsday cult. A doomed cult. Yet, this is how his son Stephen describes him, and helps explain why hundreds of people followed him into Jonestown and ultimately their deaths on November 18th, 1978. 40 years after the Jonestown tragedy, it remains a devastating reminder of the dark side of devotion. Hundreds of people died by consuming cyanide-laced flavor aid, receiving an injection, many against their will, or in the case of Jim Jones himself, a gunshot. But the flavor aid wasn't the only toxic mix on the compound. Jim Jones's paranoia and narcissism, control over his followers, and their attraction to his ideology set the stage for tragedy. The extraordinary loss and unusual circumstances of Jonestown can make it seem ominous, but the massacre is evidence of the ways people can be manipulated when their vulnerabilities, their biases, and their fears are exploited. Jim Jones was pervasive, paranoid, and power-hungry. He thrived on attention, adulation, and adulation. He had a complicated relationship with his father, groomed his children to take over the family business, plotted against his enemies, held grudges, and cheats on his wife. He was equal parts bully and charmer. Sound familiar? If you're among the majority of Americans who are displeased with the Trump regime, you may see similarities between Jim Jones and the former President Donald Trump. For the resistors, Trump's inflammatory rhetoric, reactionary policies, and racist dog whistles go beyond typical partisan divide, and the unwavering devotion of his base can mirror a cult mentality. Ideologically speaking, Donald Trump and Jim Jordan have very little in common. Jim Jones preached the virtues of socialism, pacifism, and racial egalitarianism. He adopted children from various ethnic backgrounds to create a rainbow family. He inspired hope amongst his followers for a global harmony, benevolence, and peace. Ultimately, however, he used isolation, authoritarianism, and violence to control them. Almost no one survived the Jonestown massacre, but among them was Jim Jordan's son, Stephen, who was away from the commune that day for a basketball game. While he escaped death, he lost everything and was left to grapple with the legacy of his dad in the People's Temple. This is Stephen Jordan speaking. I see so many parallels between Donald Trump and Jim Jones. Is ridiculous. My dad would meet someone, quickly read what you most feared and what you wanted most, and convince you that he was the one to save you from one and give the other to you. Since there was no social media 40 years ago, we can only speculate what Jim Jones may have done with a larger audience and a Twitter account. We do know that Trump before he was banned, used Twitter to belittle, to mock, and bully his adversaries. Mr. Jones said that this was also a favorite maneuver of his father. Speaking as Stephen Jones again, Donald Trump and my dad are excellent bullies. When all else fails, they're going to shut you up any way they have. If you would disagree with them, you're against them. And if you're against them, you're the enemy. And they believe anything they have to do to you is justified. While most people refer to the People's Temple as a cult, Jim Jones admitted that he was agnostic. The Jonestown community had a shared ideology that was more political than spiritual. Mr. Jones said that his father used spirituality but as a tool to attract and control members. But behind the scenes, there is very little of what you would call spiritual. Likewise, Donald Trump has now, months after his leaving the White House, has a fervent following among conservative Christians, despite living a life far outside the parameters of their family values platform. Some believe the isolation of the White House agitated Trump and saw him growing increasingly erratic, paranoid, and controlling. He prefers campaign-style rallies with his supporters over the day-to-day work of the executive branch itself, and may see his growing base increasingly emboldened, inspired by his angry speeches and willing to act on his violent rhetoric. And we saw that on January 6. Likewise, Stephen Jones claimed that his father became increasingly erratic, paranoid, and controlling, and his undoing came in part due to the isolation of the compound. Living in Jonestown meant there was no new people to recruit. Without the high of wooing new followers, Jim Jones grew more reliant on drugs. But according to Stephen, Jim Jones's number one drug was adulation. Perhaps Trump was like any other president, with enemies, resistors, and over-the-top supporters. But Stephen Jones believes that the similarities between his father and to Trump should be enough to convince concerned people to speak up. Mr. Jones said, "I feel Jonestown and even Hitler's Germany could not have happened had early on people had found their voice." CTP, know the truth. God bless. Peace to the left, justice to the right.